Hello and thank you for tuning into Stampscaping 101. This is a waterfall scene that I just stamped out, and kind of in the spirit, at least the coloring spirit of my previous video, kind of starting off with a grayscale foundation to a color scheme and adding colors over the top of it. Kind of created a nice somewhat realistic rock or textural version of the imagery that I happen to be using. And I've done this before, but I really want to explore that more. A lot of times I start off with various values of a certain color scheme, okay? But in this one, it's just kind of working just straight in a neutral grayscale using variations of gray that I happen to have, and I'm just kind of going with these ones because I just happen to have them. This is a Memento London Fog, Marvy number 12 gray, and just black. I don't have to use black in its full concentration and value, but I use kind of variations of it in terms of, you know, how wet it is on my applicator, and the drier it is, the lighter the black looks, and thus I can get every kind of value of whatever color I'm working in down to white, you know, depending on how much ink is on my sponge applicator. So in some ways I'm doing this application of ink like a dry brushing technique. So I don't know if this is a brush, but a dry sponging technique, you might say. So anyways, I really like the look of this kind of grayscale and kind of a tinted color look. I don't know, it has a certain mood to it, and that's something I want to explore more going forward. I don't know, there's certain possibilities with it that I can see. And I don't know, I think it gives it a, I don't know, like I said, it gives it a certain feel that I don't get with some other types of inks. I don't see it as a replacement for, you know, certainly some brighter colors where they call for it, but I don't know. This one here, people use the word photographic sometimes, but I guess out of, in terms of a lot of the ink choices and color schemes that I use, this one's probably, if you were to categorize it as something maybe a little more photographic in certain areas than other scenes. So anyways, it has its own possibilities, and it's easy too. There's just less colors used on it, so if you choose to watch it, you'll see what I'm talking about. But in this video right here, what I really emphasize is the use of, you know, some really dry applications of whatever color you're working in to achieve a full value range of that given hue. So, you know, when you look at your pads and whatever colors you happen to have, when doing it in this style, you don't have to look at your colors as just the pure form of them. In theory, you can take any color that you have and get all of the variations of it and values down to white, okay? By just using less of each color on the applicator of your choice, okay? So it really extends and expands the range of all of your existing media, you know, at least in terms of inks. So that's what I do on this one, and when you're working with kind of a more limited palette in terms of color choices, you really want to maximize each one of the colors that you do happen to have. And I don't know, it's just a really fun way to work, and it's fairly quick in terms of the color scheme. And if you ever looked at kind of some old black and white photographs, and you've seen them kind of colorized or colored tints on them, that's kind of similar to what we're doing here. You know, we establish our lighting scheme, And then what we do is we just go in with some light values. You can use some darker values too. This is a much brighter blue, but for the most part they're kind of somber, subtle tones of blues and greens, and maybe a little bit of tan in here too, but it's really minimal, and it's a really fun way to work, watching kind of those neutral grays turn to, you know, cool grays or warm grays in certain areas like that. And as always in these scenes that look like they've been splattered with paint, that's what I did on this one with my Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White, and the applicator of choice for me, which is an old toothbrush, and just taken that and splattered it right on in here like that, and over here as well. So really fun stuff. Pigment ink, of course, adds that little foggy touch to it and gives the scene an overall kind of ambiance or feeling that I'm looking for in a scene such as this one. So anyways, if you choose to watch it, hope you enjoy it. Thanks as always for tuning in, and happy stamping. Okay, we're going to do something with the waterfalls here. And after doing my last scene, I thought there was this color scheme that I've worked with before, and I really like how the results looked, and that's just going with the basic grayscale foundation and then building some colors on top of it. And there's something to that process in terms of how it can make the rocks look. I thought the rocks looked, I don't know, I hesitate to use the word realistic because that's not really what it is, but maybe naturalistic or something like that, just in terms of the color scheme. I'm not sure which ones of these I'll use. I'll just go for a real basic, simple composition. This one's Babbling Brook, this other one's Brook Falls. They can be used together, and you can do it portrait or landscape. And if you do it one way, you'll leave more room for more water, and if you do it kind of a landscape, you'll leave room for kind of more of a more space for the you know, the waterfall, I guess you can say. I guess you can do it both ways. I mean, I could stamp this really high and leave no sky at all. Maybe I'll do something like that. Okay, so I think I've found a good combination, or a combination that I want to do right now. And I'm just stamping this in black. And this is a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 piece of glossy cardstock. Alright, I have to go pretty high with this one. I'll match it up about like so. I mean, this could be higher or lower, wherever you want it to go. It could even go down here, but then I'd need to fill in something over here. Let's see, which way should I go with this? I'll just go about like that. I think that'll look pretty good. Large stamps with a lot of surface area. I like to stand up and apply pressure. I like to get a little bit more leverage and apply pressure in the center. And as you can see right here, I have quite a bit of blotter paper that I like to stamp on. It provides a little bit of an extra cushion to make up for any surface irregularities in what I'm stamping on. Okay, so there's one image, and the other one will go right here. There's no need for any masking or anything like that. You don't need to use a stamp positioner for it, because what you want to do is you want to overlap your images, and I'd say to do it about 1/8 to a 1/4 inch or so. So there's plenty of leeway. If you go more into the 1/2 inch or so, that would be okay too. So there's plenty of kind of wiggle room, you might say. Okay, so let's go about like so. So the image is right there, and I'm probably going about a 1/4 inch or so. I didn't ink up. I inked up this side anyways, even though the image is kind of going right here. But instead of, if you know you're going to use about that much, it's sometimes people just ink up right to there or something like that. But then if you kind of don't register it perfectly where it's over here, sometimes there's like a blank space on this side, you know, where you've gone over too far. So I just say ink up more than you think you're going to need, just to be safe. Okay, it's about like that. Whereas that, we have a little bit of space up here for with some extra rocks. I have kind of a smaller rock stamp that would suit that purpose as far as filling in, but why don't I just use a rip paper towel to mask off that, okay? And I'll just use some of these rocks right up here to fill in that space there. Actually, I'll grab 2 pieces of paper towel, rip it, and I have approximately a 1/4 inch of those rocks showing in here. And I'll just take this and I'll stamp it on down here. The reason why I have about that 1/4 inch of the previous impression showing is so that this will blend right into it, okay? And I don't get these gaps in between there. Alright, so easy composition. We have 2 stamps. I stamped that one twice just to use a little portion of it. And that's all I'm going to really worry about at this point in time, or consider at this point in time. I might have some foreground down here at another point, but I think I'm just going to start addressing what I already have here. So what we have is the waterfalls are coming down right here, here and here, and right here. Now a lot of people will look at waterfall imagery and they'll be thinking that water is blue or something like that, okay? So sometimes they fill in this with a pretty dark blue or even a medium blue, and then we lose the track. We lose kind of the water's path that way if we're doing that. What I like to do is I like to leave those spots light, okay? So that we can see kind of the pathway of the water. And then as it falls in here, there'll probably be some of the water churning in here, and so we see that kind of mist and maybe even frothy mist, you might say, around in this area. So I might have this area lighter. So my lighting scheme is going to be light, light, and light, and then light down here right at the base. So I just need to make everything a little bit darker. Now we can see in the imagery where the imagery is inherently darker on the stamps, okay, in the design. Those are the areas that are going to get a little bit darker, so I can use those as cues, but I don't know if I'll keep this rock that light. You know, I want that water to stand out, so this area in here will become a little bit darker, but not so dark, okay? So, let me show you what that looks like in application, alright? So, let's keep this color scheme really easy, and let's go with this London fog here. And London fog is a Memento gray. Alright. And let me see, did I clean off my stylus tools enough? This one feels a little old. I pulled some of these out of my demo supplies the other day, and some of them are a little bit less resilient. I can feel it in the sponge. These sponges last a long time, but you know, like this one right here is probably 15 years old, and it is a sponge, so they do get dried out a little bit. All right. This is impromptu stamping, folks. I need to get some of this color out. This is brown that I used on some recent scene. Just stamp your, kind of depress your sponge into, you know, paper towel or something like that. You can also take these and rinse them under the sink or whatever, and that'll clean them out just fine. Okay, let's go with this gray in here. Memento inks are fairly thick, and that's the type of consistency of ink that I like to use for my first color. Just about any ink is fairly thick, except for Marvy's. Marvy's are a little bit thinner than most inks. Now, one of the things I might encounter when I start applying some tone to my scene here is that I just re-inked my black pad. Okay, so I might end up smearing some of this if there is, like in the darkest areas, I can see a little bit of pooling of ink. Okay, so I'll kind of watch that a little bit. I'm not too worried about it because there's going to be a lot of tone that's used in here, and you know, unless there's a big puddle of ink, I don't think it's something I'm going to need to worry about. Okay, so you can see what I'm doing here. See this around my water? I'm adding some tone to the various imagery, the rocks and shapes. Okay, but I'm leaving, okay, there's a little bit of smearing. I'm leaving the water light, okay, so it kind of stands out. So we're really bringing attention to that, in this case, reflective surface of the water. Okay, down here around the base of the rocks, except at the base of the falls, I'll add some shadows, and that will give some kind of opacity to those rocks and shapes. Okay. So you can see what's kind of happening. We have a real basic lighting scheme already established with this method. Now I could have left some of those rocks a little bit lighter, but maybe I won't go over them with like my medium to darker tones. Okay. So really don't rush into your darker tones too quick, okay? Really spend some time here. Even if you get coverage with your first tone, really spend some time with it to kind of saturate your page a little bit, your card. Paper, this is glossy cardstock, by the way, if I didn't mention that. And get a good amount of it down. Sometimes just adding more color will make it darker than needing to go into the next tone, okay? So really kind of fully explore the color that you're working in, all right? Each color that I use on here will not take this long, okay? This is my first kind of base coat. So it tends to, you know, get a pretty good amount of coverage. All right, now sometimes what I don't like is if I'm leaving something light like that, sometimes I don't want it so stark white, so what I'll do is I'll kind of blot this off a little bit, and I'll add in a little bit of grayscale, or in this, you know, just some tone, whatever color I'm working in, to those lighter areas, okay? Just so that it's a little bit more integrated with the surrounding area than having it so stark white, right? So it's a little bit more mellow that way. All right, that looks good. That's Memento. Blended fog. Memento inks really blend and apply in a very graceful fashion because on glossy cardstock, because they're thick and they allow you time to kind of really spread it around. For those new to this technique, this tool that I'm using is called the Stylus Tool, if I didn't mention that. Colorbox Stylus Tool. And I'm using the oval, the gray, the white oval tip. There's also a kind of a black oval tip, but that's it's a different material meant for a different purpose. Actually, this wasn't meant for this purpose either. It was meant to make these shapes, you know, like that, which it's kind of fun in concept, but no one, I don't know, no stamper I know ever really did that. Maybe it was meant for more for the kind of just a generic crowd at a craft store that, you know, or kids, you know, wanting to do those types of things, but I'll tell you what, it makes for a really great applicator. Okay, now here's what I'm doing now. Like in areas like this, right? I don't have to apply this fully like this. Sometimes I have this at a bit of an angle like that, okay? And I like getting it in some of my shadow areas, okay? So I have it at a bit of an angle, and if I want some of these rocks to look like they're more of like volumes and rounded like this. You can see like my hand here where it's darker on the edge, and as it gets up here into the light where it's top lit, it's getting lighter and lighter, right? So that's what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about this rock as a two-dimensional object, which it is, but I want to give it the illusion that it's rounded, okay? So there's edges, so sides to it. So you see right here, I'm applying more ink kind of at the base in the shadow, but on the top of it, I might leave it just as is, so that it looks more three-dimensional that way. And rocks are really fun to do this with. I mean, I can do this with all of them if I want to, see? Like this one right here, now it's like two tones of gray. It's a little bit darker here and lighter up here. And it becomes more apparent the darker you take, the darker areas of that rock. So hopefully it looks it'll look more and more three-dimensional the darker I take it, but I'm taking it darker in a kind of a more targeted area. In other words, just not everywhere. Okay? So I'm not seeing it as like a, you know, like a flat thing to be filled in equally, okay? It's going to be more like this, you know. That's my next tone. It's lighter up here, darker down here, and then you want to make it darkest right down here. So you just kind of use more and more selective shading. In other words, the darker you get, you just apply less and less ink. So it's not a hard thing. You just do less and less the darker you go. Alright, so I'm starting to anchor this image down a little bit by kind of making that area at the base of the rocks a little bit darker. Okay. Same thing down here. We can bring in a little bit of tone down into our water. I will tint this water with some blue tones, okay, in the end, but let's just go grayscale right now. I want to see what it looks like. Kind of instead of just working through a series of blues down here, we're kind of establishing this as a, you know, in terms of just a lit area, or it'll be lit in a certain way. All right, now I don't happen to have, that was Marvy gray, by the way. I don't happen to have a darker gray pad now. That's one thing about kind of the stamp industry. They don't have like a huge grayscale, you know, tone, you know, a value range of grays. All right, because most people are into color. So, but when you get into things like Copic markers or something like that, you'll find that, you know, there's just tons of gray. I don't know. I don't know if they, you know, the stamp industry would be successful or not with several grays. You know, I doubt if like that gray from Marvy was one of their top sellers, you know, in their top, you know, 30 or something like that. I don't know. Maybe if there was more of them, more people can see that kind of that range, maybe they'd be more popular. I do like grays. But, okay, that being said, I'm just going to have to go with black, but I don't have to go with this black right here, okay? What you can do, in theory, with any type of color that you're using, you could get, with this method, all the ranges, the value range of whatever color you're working with in the strongest saturation, all the way to white, right? And you can do that just by applying less of that color. So I've squeezed out a lot of that ink right here, of that black. So what am I left with? You know, I'm left with that tone right there, which is barely visible, but you can see the more that I add and tap, the darker it gets, okay? So you want to be using kind of various incarnations of that color, and they're being created by really how much ink you have on this tip right here, and with what pressure you apply it in, okay? I happen to use a very light touch, okay, when I'm doing this. I'm just gliding it on the surface of the paper. If it's catching, then I just use less pressure, okay? It's just barely touching it, really. And to get the darker tone, I'm just getting it in repetition, okay? Sometimes people get impatient and they want to achieve a certain value of something in one swipe. They want to just see it appear. And when you do it that way, it becomes more precarious, you know, and you don't want to get like these types of shapes, you know, like that everywhere. But that's what happens when I'm depressing it all the way, okay? These tips are sponges, okay? So there is ink inside of them, and the more you press down, the more you're squeezing out. Now, if you want a lot of some color, like maybe, you know, those first colors, you know, where like that gray that we used, the first gray, the Memento, if you do want a lot of that color, because we did get a lot of coverage with it, you can do that. You can press some, you know, squeeze some of that ink out of your tip and then just wipe it into the scene. But I wouldn't recommend that with your darker tones. I find that the darker tones are ones that I want to have, you know, a lot of control over, because I don't want a big, huge mark on the paper that I don't like, and it doesn't guarantee that you'll get something kind of unintentional and something that you don't like, but there's just more chance of it the faster you try to take this process, okay? But it is faster, kind of the slower you go, because there's less kind of areas that you have to kind of cover up. So in other words, the only thing, this isn't a precarious type of process, but if someone goes like that, it's blending that type of thing, you know, out from the middle here that takes a while. But if you just kind of take this in a nice gradual fashion, it's a very easy process, because you're really not applying too much ink at any given time. So you see it kind of developing right before your eyes, very, gradually. And with that being said, you can apply as much as you want of that color to that given space or object. Okay? So you can see these rocks in here becoming a little bit more three-dimensional. It's dark on the side, lighter on the top, dark on the side, lighter on the top. I mean, there could be an area that's completely in shadow, like I can do like this. Like say, for example, I want to... Now here's the thing about lighting and kind of focal points, all right? My eye goes to this falling water because it's lighter, but if I want to direct my viewer's eye even more to this area in here, what I can do is I can make the area around here darker. And what is that doing? It's kind of bringing this kind of like this vignette effect to the composition. So it's kind of closing off the composition a little bit more by doing that. I can do it in the bottom corner as well. All right. And I feel that it contains things a little bit more, and if you make things a little bit darker on the edge, corners, the light areas of your scene will look by contrast, okay? I mentioned that in just about every video, it seems, but that's the thing about lighting. My approach to lighting is, it's very, very basic, I guess you can say. Light tones get applied across the majority of the scene. Mid-tones about half, and the darkest areas, there's less of an application of it. You can see I'm kind of doing more of these kind of shorter strokes and given areas. And where do I do that? I just need to, every time you switch colors and you go darker, you don't need to, you're not reinventing where you're applying it. You're applying it where you've applied your lighter tones, except you're just not applying as much of it in those spaces. So like, for example, this rock right here has light gray, kind of a medium gray, and now I'm going black. Okay, so the black is just being applied in the darkest of areas. It's not getting as much coverage, it's getting a little bit more specific, and I'm just using less of it. Where people kind of lose control of their lighting, it's because they color everything kind of with an equal coverage. Okay, so everything just gets dark, all right? But the key to it, and you can really see it down here, the lights go all the way in here. The medium gray went to about, I'm guessing right around here. It's hard to tell sometimes when you're overlapping and blending things. And you can see the black is right down here, so medium, or light, medium, and dark, okay? No, I mean, that's not hard set rule. Like, I like some streaks of in things like water and sky, you know, just as a design element. So I'll bring some of that in there, but I'm not streaking it in like, you know, like that, like really harsh, okay? It's just a light wisp, okay? So that looks like something like this. I'm using a very light touch, okay? And if I like something, then I'll just add more of it, okay? I'll just streak across there, more and more, all right? Maybe the streaks down in the darker area are darker streaks, okay? All right, so we have something like that. Now, let's start addressing some of the color considerations in here. And let me see here. I think what I'll do is I'll go with some blue. All right, there's some blue on this tip already. Some of these painters of old used to do some very realistic still lifes, and they're called like trompe-l'oeil, to fool the eye. And a lot of it was kind of similar to this, as I understand it. It was kind of creating a grayscale composition, and then what they would do is they would work on top of it with colors and just layer. They might layer, I don't know, dozens of transparent tones on top. So it's like a real kind of a basic, simplistic kind of a take on that concept. So I have my grayscale scene. The lighting has already been established. So all there is to do is you can go back in here and add some tones to it, okay? This one happens to be the Memento Summer Sky. It's a really nice light blue. And again, it's a thick blue, so it's almost an invisible blue. Okay, here it comes. It's very, very light. Now, if I do want some areas to remain light, it's important for me to not just color in everything. I still want to retain some of that white of the paper, so I can bring this into these areas where there's some grays in there already. I hope the camera is picking that up a little bit. See, it's almost silvery down here, huh? Like there's a patina. And I didn't put any up here yet, but I will. Okay, so see where I've still left some of the lightness in here. But now, this is a time when I can come in and I can add some of this to my water. Okay, it's a very pale blue in here. If I stamp something out in Memento Summer Sky, you know, I'd be able to see it more, but the way that I'm using it here, it's just a very subtle shade. And I like that, you know, when I'm starting to build up certain colors, I like to see what I'm getting first, and if I use a really light value of a given hue, I can get kind of an idea. It's more of a hint of what that color can look like in the scene, rather than making a big, huge commitment to a given color right off the bat. So see, if I went with like one of these blues, like that, they're very bright and kind of a mid-tone, but if I go with something like that, then I'll achieve something like this. Okay? So that's why this process is very, for me, I'm looking for a very incremental process, I guess you can say. So it's I don't know if the word is safe, you know, things develop gradually. I guess there's just more control over it that way, especially when we're talking about lighting or something of that sort. By the way, this is Bahama Blue. It's very bright, isn't it? So, gotta apply with care so that you don't get more than what you think you might want, okay? If I get more of, you know, some blue, like, oh my gosh, that's too bright, I don't like it, you can apply some, go back to your grays or something like that and subdue it a little bit with some gray over the top of it. Okay. adding some to my shadows. I did use black in there, and black is darker than this Bahama blue, but you know, the way that I use the black though, I just applied it kind of in a almost a dry brush type of application, so that this blue does show up in those black areas, okay? I feel it gives it a nice rich gray tone because we're kind of introducing temperature into it. Blue, of course, is you know, usually a cool tone. There are kind of warmer looking blues sometimes, you know, if you add kind of an aqua look to it. But as far as the color, though, it's in the cool spectrum, of course. All right, so that's Bahama Blue. Look at this. This is a nice kind of glow down here, isn't it? Maybe I'll get a little bit more of it over here. That's what it looks like in a stronger saturation. Okay, so if I want it over here, just to kind of balance it out. See, I'm getting it with repetition. I'm just going over here and I can add as much as I want. And there's a lot more control over it that way. And it makes it really easy. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for ease of application, all right? So remember, slowing it down, it doesn't make it harder, it makes it easier, because you have just a lot more control over it. Alright, that was a pretty dark blue. I don't know if this Danube blue will show up on here. Let's give it a try, though. It does a little bit. At this point in time, though, what's happening is most of these inks, except for the Marvies, are fairly thick, okay? So that when let's get a close-up right here. So sometimes if I apply it like that, you can see it right there, right? But then see, as I blend it out like that, it just kind of wipes right off the page. Well, it is building up here a little bit. That looks okay. But I was going to say the thicker inks start to build up on your page quite a bit. So that's why sometimes I like to go, well, most of the time, I like to go with a thicker ink as my base layer, and then I move into my Marvy inks because they're thinner and they'll penetrate and transfer onto the card, onto the paper. See that? How that really kind of tints that area right there? This is a Prussian blue from Marvy. It's a very dark blue, which isn't the reason why it's, or the only reason why it's more visible. It's because the ink is thinner. So see, it's able to get past that thicker ink that's been built up onto the surface of that glossy cardstock. See that? Okay. Alright, my camera battery. I just ordered this AC camera thing so I won't run out of battery anymore. I think it comes in today or tomorrow. But anyways, my battery's about to run out on this camera. And I have a spare, but at some point in time there'll be a break here. Okay, hitting the shadow in here. Sometimes the brightest colors, or oftentimes the brightest colors, are in the shadows because it's not being kind of washed out by lighting. Like on a high noon day, you know. The colors are lighter, but they're not brighter. The brightest colors you'll see on kind of an overcast day or something like that sort. So, I hit some of those colors in the shadows. and that livens up those shadows a little bit. But see how much, how mottled these rocks look by not applying those darker tones over the entire thing, right? Now I want to kind of create a little bit of more of a transition between those two rocks or two different waterfalls that I stamped out. So I'm going to just make that area in here a little bit darker on parts of those rocks. I think I'll go back to black as well. Kind of hit that area in there a little bit. Okay. Bring a little bit darker corner vignette to that area. Okay. So we have our kind of foundation in here. It looks like, you're kind of walking through like a rainforest or something like that, and maybe we're underneath a canopy of trees or something like that where the light is coming down into here. Let's see what we can do about bringing in some additional life into the scene, okay? Now, when we're talking about color, there are some different properties to color. There's hue, what color something is, the value of it, the relative light and darkness of it, and then there's intensity, how bright something is, but then there's temperature, all right? Now we've applied a lot of cool tones in here. Well, one cool hue, and that's blue, but we did it in different values. So what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of temperature to this, and I think by doing that we're extending kind of that kind of the visual vocabulary of a given piece. So just putting in a hint of like warmth into an otherwise entire cool color scheme can really introduce potentially an interesting aspect to the color scheme. All right, let's see what it looks like here. All right, this is a distressing peeled paint. It's kind of a nice earthy, I don't know, yellow-green. And what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm just gently bringing this into the darker area because I don't want it to stand out too much. I want to get kind of an idea of what it's going to look like. So I put it into the darker area first. And I could see it. See how it's just kind of, see how it's different than over here? And that's what I do. I've done these compositions, many times before, not this exact one. And I've done, warm and cool before, but every scene comes out a little bit different, so I'm really not quite, or exactly sure what something's going to look like, so I still just follow my application process of building something up nice and slowly. And I can see it getting, warmer and greener and greener. But isn't that different, though? It's because we've added a little bit of warmth into there. So it feels different. It feels more kind of full to me. I mean, it's subtle. I mean, it wouldn't be quite as subtle if we went with, like, if we say, okay, let's go with the green, if I went with something like that, you know? Now, if all I had was something like that, I can take that, ink it up, and blot it off a lot, and kind of dry brush it in, right? Just like I did to achieve my gray tones with black, you can achieve very pale green with a very bright green, okay? So remember, doing this type of application, you can really, really get a lot of mileage out of your existing pads and existing colors. Most people take pad colors and they're meant to stamp, ink it up, and you stamp something out in that color, right? But what you can do in this type of process is you can take a look at your pads, and you're not only looking at them in terms of their usability, in terms of their full, deepest incarnation, but you can look at all of your pads and think about them from that incarnation all the way through the values down to white and everything in between. So you can take your pads, and if you have a set of, whatever, 15, 20 of them, you can think about them in terms of having, 150 pads, because there's 10 values between this and white or whatever. The darker you go, you'll have much more of a, kind of a grayscale choice in between there. Okay, battery change, that happened. All right. So what I'm doing in here is I'm adding in, what am I doing with this green? Well, the green, I'm not just adding, I wouldn't add like yellow in here, but this, an area like this can potentially have like this idea of like this moss growing on top of the rocks. You might have seen those types of photographs before. It looks like an enchanted forest or something like that, and those enchanted forest types of photographs, oftentimes there's like moss, right? There's growth, there's life, over things. Those enchanted forests usually aren't dry and arid, So, alright, so that's what we have right there. I'm thinking about going into the water and kind of bringing in a little bit of warmth into that area as well. Why don't we do that? So it could be that there's just kind of a warmer look to some of the water, or water also reflects kind of the things around it in many ways. So maybe I can just bring some of that hue, some of that temperature into my water. And also it brings somewhat of a continuity. You don't need to do it everywhere, but just bringing some of that into some areas like that, it'll create a stronger continuity between this area down here and the other space, or the other objects. Alright, so that looks good right there. Now, alright, this is something that I have a lot of fun with. If you watched other videos, let's add some kind of splashing water at the base of the waterfalls, and there's no better technique for that for me than to use some bleed-proof white with an old toothbrush and to do kind of a splatter paint application down here. And then I love kind of a misty look around the base of waterfalls, churning water is creating kind of a mist. I think it gives it a really nice kind of atmosphere and look to it. And I don't know, just in terms of, I'm real kinesthetic, so I like the feeling. I like to, in my visuals, I like to kind of imagine this feeling of you know, the moisture in the air and kind of just having an overall feel of that setting. So anyways, I need to go and clean off this brush. It's real crusty because I didn't wash it off last time, but this stuff, bleed proof white, washes off anything that you use it with beautifully. So we'll do that, and then I'll be right back. Okay, we have a nice clean brush. It's a used brush. And here's our scene without all that glare. You're looking at it like that, but one of the things I forgot to do was we have, going back to kind of that grayscale in my comments on kind of alcohol-based pens. See these pens right here? It's a nice color scheme, right? If you have any grayscale or light tones or colors that kind of relate to the colors that you've used in here, that's a bit too dark. You might want to think about applying them into your scene. There's only so much. This is a kind of a, this is called Melon. It's a La Plume Permanent, just, you know, it's like alcohol-based pen. But if you want to, you can kind of go in here and get very specific areas because, you know, the nature of a pen, it's just, you know, you have that kind of narrow tip there, or brush tip in this case. And I can get in areas that I couldn't get in using that sponge tip. The sponge tip's not huge, but, you know, I can just kind of get in here. But I like just kind of going in and cool gray. Okay. And I just like to reiterate some of the things that I've done in there, but in a much more targeted area. So if there's like little shadows on the image, the designs, like the little seams in between one rock and the next where there's some shadow, I just kind of go in and I just reiterate that with this pen right here. So see, I can get in this little area right here, some area back there, in between these waterfalls, okay, these two falls kind of converging. And when you do this type of touch, you can make those images look even more dimensional. You can give them some opacity by creating a little bit of a shadow at the base of them. And see, I'm just going with these lighter tones, so it's not like a big jump in terms of this one's brownish gray, a little bit of a different hue. It's going to be very subtle because we already have some colors laid down, and alcohol inks are transparent inks, so you're going to see the color from underneath influencing what you see on the surface here. And I can do other things. I can bring in some other blues in here, but I don't think I really need to do that. So that's really fun to go in there. And you can give a little texture too if you want to give, you know, put some lichen or something like that on those rocks. I don't know if you'd have lichen in there because they're so covered in moss anyway, but you can do all those types of things and bring in all kinds of different textures and whatnot. Alright, now we need to reconstitute a little bit more of this Dr. Martin's bleed proof white because I'm going to be splatter painting it. And let's get something to mix this up with, okay? So this tends to dry out quite a bit, so you just add some water into it and mix it up. You don't want a ton of water. You don't want it too thin. You don't want it too thick. But there's not like a real perfect consistency. There's a lot of leadway, and this paint is quite opaque, so that's why they call it bleed proof white. Whatever it is, it just must be such super fine granules of that paint in there or something. It just covers up everything. So it's a very opaque white watercolor paint. Okay. Don't get too much on your brush, all right? Trying to get this to focus on my... I need to cover up the background. Okay. There. Okay, it's still focused on the scene there. Some of this autofocus doesn't work so great. Okay, but I'm taking out a lot of this too, okay? I want to splatter paint it. I don't want it to drip all over, so kind of get it on there. Here we go. See that? I don't want a big blob of paint all over my thing. Maybe I should wipe it off that top part right here. Okay, and what it's going to look like is this. Kind of have to test it out on a piece of paper, because sometimes it's hard to remember what angle to put this at, where it's going to splatter. Okay, so that's what you're kind of going after. If it's too blobby like that, maybe there's too much paint in there. So you see, kind of get it. See that blob right there? So kind of get some of it out first, or just don't put so much in there like I did, maybe. It holds quite a bit, doesn't it? Here, let me get some of that out. Gosh, that was way too much. It's like the never-ending toothbrush here. All right. Boy, did I load that up. Maybe it's because it was real thin. It's probably thinner than I usually make it. I probably added too much water. So, just splatter it out, you know, just like don't use as much, you know, don't use so much black ink, use less, you know. Let me test this again, just to make sure. Alright, that's looking pretty good. There's a lot in there. Let me get that out of there. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Potential technique for a different application, though. Alright. Is there a more fun technique in stamping? I don't know. Splattering. Okay. You can see, I mean, I don't need to add a ton of it, but you can see it down here, right? Okay. And I'm just kind of doing it slowly so that it it applies where I kind of want it to apply. But the nature of kind of this technique is that sometimes it just kind of goes wherever it's going to go. All right, here. It's kind of splattering everywhere. I want it just in this little area. Let me use shorter strokes. Here we go. I'm using my splatter guard. Okay, here we go. See that at the base of those falls? Same over here. Okay. I did get some up there, but so be it. I don't think it looks bad up there. It kind of gives a little bit of a, I don't know, texture for sure, but it gives it a little bit of contrast or whatever up there. Now, if I don't want that up there, if you just allow that to dry, and if you take a dry paper towel, in fact, I'll do that. I'll show you in a bit here. This paint dries really fast too. I guess it's because it's so chalky or something like that. But, well, let me see. It'll buff right out. You see those two little dots right up here? You can just take this and they're gone. Or this whole area up here. If you don't want it, then just take it out of there. Okay. So, again, I tend to work in very forgiving techniques, because if I don't want something, I don't want to be stuck with it. Now, if I get a big blob of paint, you just kind of have to, and that happened to me one time in one of these videos, I just have to sop it up like that and just kind of buff it out. And do that with a dry paper towel too, because you don't want to take a wet paper towel and take it down there, because, you know, the dye-based inks are water-based inks, so it will, you know, kind of lift some of the color that you've applied. Alright, so that's a very sharp, you know, application of a given hue. And what I might want to do too, for that kind of more misty type of effect, is I'll take some of my pigment ink, and, okay, this is my, I have a couple of these Colorbox pads. One of these pads has a lot of ink in it, and one of them's kind of drier. This one's my drier one, which is perfect for this purpose, because I don't want to apply too much of this ink at any given time. Okay, so it's a dry brushed application, okay? So this right here, even if I do a very haphazard type of application, it's not a big thick blob of paint, okay? But that's not what the application you want to do it when. You want to do kind of a lighter touch, okay? Now I'm adding this in my lighter areas at first, okay? Because that's, you know, going back to kind of that careful application idea. It doesn't show up as much in the light areas, right? But where I like to add it is where light meets dark. And that transition from light, dark, I like to soften a little bit. So you see this little fall right here. What I can do is I can come into that area and add a little bit of this pigment ink, okay? Now, where people have a difficult time with this pigment ink is there's just way too much ink on the tip here. So if you remove most of it off, almost to where, like a couple taps, you can't see anything at all, okay? That's what you want, alright? And that way, it really removes any type of potential kind of precarious type of process. Just, it completely removes that potential aspect of the application, alright? So just make it nice and gradual and somewhat methodical. Use a light touch, and you'll have a real easy time with this paint here. So again, maybe one or two taps, you can't see anything. Oh, and a tip for the tips here. I tend to like to use the real cotton tips. You know, some of them are kind of acrylic and real tightly wound, I guess. Those types aren't as good as the cotton ones. If you want kind of a softer look in the scene, okay, like that, then you want a soft applicator, right? Does that make sense? And see, by blotting it off like this, what I was also doing is I was kind of fraying and smashing the tip here, okay? You can see how kind of, you know, loose it is now. Okay. So isn't this fun? You know, in terms of a waterfall, there's the visuals of a waterfall, falling water, okay? And that's easy to achieve. All you have to do is stamp out an image, and those look good. But if you want kind of the feel of, you know, a given location, then kind of making your viewer, you know, whoever's looking at your scene, if you make them kind of aware visually of the space in between objects, okay? So we're looking at this waterfall here, and the thing that gives us the feel of that falling water, in my opinion, is this awareness of space in between us and it. So what we're doing is we're saying that there's these suspended little particles in the air splashing, okay? But also by creating this kind of mist, what you're doing is you're saying there's light, there's kind of moisture in the air, and the light is hitting it and thus illuminating it. So it's this, the things in the air, okay? And that's the things that you would feel right on your skin and whatnot. So it's like this is nothing but visual, but by doing something like this, you're kind of adding, in some ways, kind of a visual representation of a different sense, right? And that's feeling touch. So we've expanded out into that, something like that, and I don't know, and maybe in doing so, maybe, you know, when someone looks at a scene or a visual, if it becomes, if you're kind of tapping into, in some ways, you're really not, but it's kind of a mental notion of, you know, touch, then, I don't know, maybe when you look at something like this, it's almost like you can almost hear the water flowing or something like that, because you're just tapping into more, you know, these senses, you know, for your viewer. And I don't know, it's one of those things about why people like sunsets and things like that. It's when all that moisture, the dust, the pollution or whatever, you know, in the air becomes illuminated with colored light. It's, we're aware of all that lighting around us. That's why like photographers like going out and they call it the golden hour. It's when all those colors change, and you know, we can see those colors. I mean, we can see those those sediments in the air, moisture, dust, and pollen. There's like a volcano around the world sometimes, you know, for a certain period of time when that ash, you know, comes around to your area, the sunsets really become incredible because there's just more in the air to be illuminated, to be lit. All right, so I use a lot of this in the light areas, and as I move out, I use less. Sometimes when I'm doing this type of touch right here, this type of effect, so a lot of times I remove more than I add. So in other words, as I'm adding it and adding it and adding it, sometimes I add too much and I remove it and remove it. And I just keep doing that. Sometimes I just keep adding more than what looks good because I want to find out what the ideal amount of it is. So sometimes I go over the amount because I can always remove it. This paint kind of stays, or this ink stays moist on your paper for, you know, a certain period of time. Pigment inks don't dry on glossy paper quickly, so that gives you time to kind of just go in here, and if you want to, you can kind of remove it like this. Alright? See that? I can remove more and more, and then it's gone. Now, I liked it there. I just did that as an example. Okay? But anyways, little embellishments done in crisp and soft applications using different media. And it makes for a fun kind of a process here. I love doing that splatter painting. It's just a lot of fun, you know. I mean, even doing something like that, I like the look. And then adding that pigment ink in there, it really just, like, especially for something like this, or lighting, it does worlds for lighting, I think, you know, and it just makes it really fun to do. I think the area down here can use some kind of foreground, and maybe I'll get to something like that. I don't know, figure it out and come back and finish this up. But right now I gotta run, and sometimes having a few minutes in between what you've created and potential additional things you can do to the scene come to mind. So I'll let this sink in for a little bit. But that was a fun part of the water right there. Okay, we're back. And I've allowed the card to dry a little bit. It didn't really need to, but I don't know, it's given me some time to take a break from the scene, and taking a look at it, I thought that the rock here looked like it could use a little bit of texture. Doesn't it look kind of plain and, I don't know, I guess non-textural? And I thought we could remedy that with a little bit of texture in the form of some, what would be just the easiest thing to do. And I've just picked out some colors in alcohol markers. And let's see what that looks like. I want to go kind of light. I don't, you know, I want to go with just some little bit of texture in the form of some kind of little stippling work, maybe. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. If I do it in one spot, it's kind of best to do it in another spot or two, just so it's not kind of an isolated texture. But you just kind of have to apply some of it and see what it looks like. And if you like it, then add more. If it looks kind of out of place, then I would recommend kind of working with that a little bit and see what you can get. Sometimes something might not look right, but only because it's been applied kind of in isolation. But if you apply it in multiple areas, then it kind of comes together as a kind of as a universal texture that's been used in more than one area. Alright, that looks okay, but it's a little bit too textured. So one of the nice things about alcohol inks is that you can take other alcohol inks right on top of it and kind of blend it out a little bit. And what's happening is that alcohol ink that I've laid down there it's kind of moving around a little bit. And I think that looks a little bit better like that. It's somewhat subtle, but it takes that kind of flat area as it existed, and it puts a little bit of variation onto it. I think that looks just a little bit better. It doesn't stand out as kind of a flat, smooth, isolated surface anymore. Okay, now down here, I kind of like what's going on down here. I don't really want... I could add more water texture in the form of some stamps and imagery, but I don't think it needs it. I kind of like this, I don't know, this feeling that it kind of gives. It's really soft and really still, and I want to just keep it that way. The only thing I was wondering is if I should add in a little bit more tone in here, but what I want to do, I think we can break that up a little bit in the form of some foreground imagery. So let's just stamp out. I don't want too much of this. I'm thinking about the tops, and I thought it would pair well with you know, the setting. So this is rocks and leaves, but I'll just use the top of it. I mean, there's a lot of different images you can go with. I kind of thought some low-line brush, though, more than trees would look pretty good in here. Although you could do some pine trees or any type of tree if you want to. It could be a tropical setting. If I put a palm frond or something like that, it wouldn't look out of place. So it's a really universal type of setting that we have here. I mean, even still, after I add in, you know, like these types of foreground elements, it still could be forest, you know, it could be tropical forest, it could be, you know, pine forest. It could really be any number of things. As long as it's kind of damp, you know, it looks like it's, you know, we have moss in here. Okay, there's some leaves right there. And I won't leave them just isolated like that, so we'll add in some additional forms. About like so. Okay. It kind of, it puts us as the viewer of the scene, kind of standing on shore as opposed to standing out in the water now, because we have this foreground here. And why don't we go for some of these branches from the oak branch image. I'm not going to use the whole thing, so I'm just using portions for what I want, for what will serve me in this scene. Let's see. Trying to think of where I want it. Maybe coming in from the side. This kind of acts as a framing device as well. Not only do can you use tone and make the edges around it a little bit darker, but you can also kind of create somewhat of a framing device with the use of foreground imagery. In this case, it's some shrubs or something, a bush, a branch, branches. And also what you're doing is you're kind of increasing the depth of field of a scene. We have something very close to us now, as well as, I don't know, somewhat distant. It's not too far. It's not like there's a sky in there or something like that. But within that field of view, we have these bushes right here, and these little plants down here. Okay. It's a little bit more grounded, I think, in terms of having kind of somewhat of a visual anchor looking into the scene. And, alright, now that being laid down there, it stands out a little bit too much for me, so let me see if I could find my tip that I was using for my black. Probably that one. Alright, and going in and see that right there? Now the bush is kind of coming out from the shadows down here a little bit more. So it somewhat blends in, yet when it goes into the light, it's coming out of the light now. And going a little bit darker makes the lighter elements and areas seem a little bit lighter by contrast. It would really be best if I waited for this to dry down here. It's a little bit wet. I just re-inked this black pad too before I started this clad, so the imagery is fairly juicy, but I'm not going to wait for it to dry here. I've already waited long enough to finish this scene up, and I want to do it. Okay. Remember, when doing this type of thing, this type of work, use your kind of drier version of the color that you're working in, so you have a lot of control over it. I'm actually going over some of that white paint as well, and it's kind of toning it. I have now kind of gray splatters as well, which is kind of nice. You know, you can have a variation of that texture in there by just applying some ink over the top of it. Doesn't all have to be real stark white. So you can have the benefit of the texture, but it's a more kind of subtle version of it. And applying a little bit more to that rock, varying it a little bit. Okay. So these are all like the little tweaks. Taking it from something like what I would consider an intro scene, okay? But to tell you how I do, I take a scene from a very basic color scheme to what, you know, what could be considered a little bit more advanced. All right, it's not a precarious process, okay? Because see, what I'm doing is I'm adding like that amount of ink in whatever color or value to the scene in select areas, just a little bit at a time like that. And when you work in a really kind of incremental, gradual process like that, say if I want something a little bit darker, then I just keep adding it like that. It'll give you a lot of control over your scene, how a scene looks, how a given rock might look. And it all adds up to a, you know, an overall kind of finish. Now see, I can get darker. So I start off with like a 5% or a, I don't know, 3% gray. And then I can work all the way into like a 50% gray or something like that. But that's just repetitive taps, okay? So nothing really happens very quickly, at least in this process that I use. And it's all very controlled, and it just kind of comes into focus, you might say, in terms of a finished piece. It's like really slowly. It's like taking a knob and just barely turning it, you know? And it's not anything, I don't know, tedious. I find it quite relaxing. And I can see the changes that are happening on here. as it goes, but it's just kind of doing it in a very, I don't know, methodical way, I guess you can say. Someone asked me recently if I ever make mistakes, and I don't know, there's times when like certain color schemes or something like that just don't seem to come out, but it's not like I ever go in here and I do like that or something like that and then it's like right in the middle here. Okay, so in the toning process it's all very, you know, kind of controlled. I get color schemes, you know, with all that mixing of the colors and layering of the colors. Like there's certain scenes that just I don't like the color scheme as much with the way it turned out, but most of the times it's just a matter of kind of checking something out, seeing if you like it, adding a little bit more and more and more, and just stopping at some point in time. And it's not one of those things where it's like, you know, how do you know when to stop? Okay, I mean, this card could have been done, you know, without 20 minutes of additional work on there, and it would look fine. But nothing happens where, I mean, if I'm just adding a little bit of color at a time, it's not like I'm doing that and, oh my, I did one tap too much, you know, or something like that. It's just happening so gradually. It just builds up, and you can stop at any time, and, you know, there's a big, you know, leeway when, you know, there's a kind of a difference between just right and too much. You know, there's a there's a lot of wiggle room, I should say. Okay, this is a gel pen. If you want a little bit of extra control, instead of going with a splatter paint, you can take a white gel pen like this, and I can add in, you know, some extra splashes or texture on this water. Let's put a few highlights kind of in the direction that the water is flowing. Sometimes if I do this gel pen over the top of that Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White, sometimes it can be a little bit hard to apply because you start kind of rolling into some of that real chalky, like watercolor paint, and you know, it kind of stops the ball from flowing very well. Or the ball point from rolling very well, I guess. So this is a way to go in and get really some kind of detailed, very exact placement of, you know, this kind of texture. So it's a good way to kind of also depict movement in a scene. It's, you know, we're stamping static imagery, so it's always one of those things. It's like what I was doing with what I was talking about, the kinesthetic nature. If you look at a scene, you want to kind of have a feeling like you can feel what it's like to be there, but and also when it comes to kind of static imagery, if you can kind of bring in or add an element of movement into a scene, it's kind of nice. It gives it that extra little, I don't know, touch in terms of finished piece. And sometimes it's just a matter of putting a few little dots at the base of a waterfall, or putting a few little stars in the sky, or, you know, sometimes if there's a sun with a flare, I'll put, you know, I'll trail some little dots out like that, giving it the feeling of movement happening in there. And that kind of texture is kind of fun because you're adding this element of contrast into an otherwise, you know, kind of rich but static area. You know, you take all those little splashes out of here, you know, and it looks a little bit more, I don't know, what would be the term? Still, I guess, which isn't a bad thing. But where you have that kind of flowing water now, I get a sense of kind of movement happening with that, especially with that kind of random application of that bleed-proof white. You can kind of see it like right there, even it kind of, there's some areas that kind of splattered, you know, in this elongated splatter. And that kind of adds to it all. That's why I kind of splattered it from here, and it went that way, you know, away from that splashing water. Okay, so see how much fun that looks right there? It's certainly fun to apply, even in the background there. I feel little dots at the base of the waterfall. And it's probably not, you're probably not going to be able to pick it up, but I put a few little strokes of that white gel pen in those waterfall areas, so there's a little bit of texture to it. So anyways, waterfalls. I really enjoy doing water, and this is another reason why I kept those areas light, okay? If I made those waterfalls up here that color of blue, they really won't even stand out too much. You can use a little bit of more color in there, maybe, and that would be nice. Or, I don't know, maybe just a super, super pale blue. Let's see, this is called, actually, this is called pale blue. I don't know if that's going to show up. It's almost invisible, but maybe I can add some of that in there. In a couple select areas, or I can add a darker blue too and then kind of blend it in with this one. That might be enough. This is the beauty of kind of alcohol pens in various values of their hue. You can just take it and go straight onto the paper with it and not really worry about it. And then you can add a darker one, and if you don't like it, you can kind of go back in there with a lighter one and almost blend it right out. These lighter ones over the top of the darker ones almost act as blending, kind of just clear blending markers. Okay, so anyways, that is the waterfall scene, and hope you enjoyed the creation of it. I want to thank you for tuning into the channel, and if you have any questions, as always, just drop me a note in the comments section. Okay? Thanks for watching the channel.